I was presented with an interesting issue this week when a listing agent called me about a contract he had that was contingent on the sale of other property. He had received a backup for his seller, and the seller had accepted the backup offer. So, pursuant to the sale of other property addendum, the seller presented to the buyer under the primary that he had received an offer and requested that the contingency either be waived or that the buyer terminate the primary contract so that the seller could accept the backup as a primary. As it was, the buyer waived his contingency for sale of other property. And the listing agent explained that he knew for a fact that the buyer could not close on the property until he sold his prior home. And he asked if there was anything he could do to force the buyer then to terminate his contract. And unfortunately, my answer to him had to be no, it was a buyer contingency. When the seller accepts a backup, all the seller can do with the buyer is request that the buyer waive the contingency or terminate the contract. It's not up to the seller. So in this market of multiple offers and strong backups, you need to consider if you receive a contract and your seller is willing to accept the offer contingent on sale of other property, there's a provision under that addendum that if the buyer waives that contingency when presented with the fact that the seller has accepted a backup offer, the buyer will deposit additional earnest money. You need to consider in the seller's market getting enough earnest money on that waiver to make the risk of waiving a contingency substantial to the buyer. Because if the buyer then waives that contingency and then cannot close because they didn't sell their prior house, they will lose their earnest money to the seller. On the other hand, if you don't put up enough earnest money, buyers in this market think their houses are going to sell quickly. They're willing to accept the risk and waive the contingency, although they know for a fact that they cannot buy it without selling their property. All they stand to lose is their earnest money if you don't get enough to make it painful for them.